Welcome to episode 6 of Tales from the Rabbit Hole. My guest today is Tim Osman. At least that's the name he goes by. Tim is a conspiracy theorist and he is a debunker. He has done a lot of very good work debunking the flat earth conspiracy theory by making videos demonstrating the curve using drones and such like. And he's also very into conspiracy theories like 9/11 in terms of actually believing that 9/11 was an inside job and other conspiracies like that. So he draws the line on the conspiracy spectrum at a different position that I do. The conversation kind of starts off a little bit adversarial, and Tim kind of ends up interrogating me about my beliefs, but we end up having a good time. Alrighty, so should we just get into it?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So I am recording this for use on my podcast, which I've been running for like a few weeks now. And what it is a podcast where I talk to people who are involved in conspiracy culture, basically. I try to talk to people who are former conspiracy theorists or current conspiracy theorists or people who are just like debunkers and investigators. And I think you are kind of all of the above to some degree or another. Would you agree with that?
Well, I would actually probably first want to start out for you to give me a definition of what a conspiracy theorist is.
All righty. Well, a conspiracy theory is a posited explanation for large-scale events that involve some kind of large-scale, high-powered conspiracy theory. Well, obviously, conspiracy theory in the simple sense of that. A conspiracy by powerful people, usually for nefarious purposes. Like, for example, the theory that JFK was killed by secret elements within the US government or by secret elements within the CIA would be considered a conspiracy theory because it seeks to explain an event by a powerful conspiracy amongst higher level people done in secret for nefarious purposes.
Under that definition, then, would you consider yourself as a conspiracy theorist as far as 9/11 comes? Because there's a conspiracy that 17-ish box cutter people came on planes and basically foiled NORAD and flew around for 45 minutes and crashed planes into buildings and the Pentagon and in Shanksville. Would you consider yourself then a conspiracy theorist, or maybe even we'll add mainstream conspiracy theorist?
Well, you see, we're kind of getting into the semantics there. Like, what we talk about is you could call it a theory or a hypothesis or the current prevailing theory, and it involves a conspiracy. But, what people normally understand by conspiracy theory is something done by people high up in power of, the state that you are in. So the theory that I believe happened on 9/11 is kind of what you say, hijackers hijacking planes. They didn't all use box cutters. Some of them actually had quite large knives. But minor point, and it was a conspiracy. And I guess, if you want to kind of try to argue on semantics, then that is a conspiracy theory. But what people normally understand by conspiracy theory is not something like that.
Well, of course, we're defining terms, so that would definitely fall on the lines of semantics. So that's why I wanted to clarify, because in my opinion, MetaBunk.com doesn't actually really go into any of the conspiracies that are known that were conspiracy theories, and actually tries to upheaval some of the people like 9/11 architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth and other people that are actually probably more qualified than yourself and the people that are on your forum.
Yeah, well, what I try to do is just focus on things where I figure I can actually bring some of my minor expertise to bear. Like, I have a little bit of expertise in physics and 3D graphics and things like that. And I have some just experience in looking into these things. So on MetaBunk, I tend to focus on things where I can actually figure stuff out and contribute to the greater knowledge base. So, I do address things like 9/11, and I do criticize a lot of the stuff that architects and engineers put out. But I don't think, you really want to focus on qualifications so much if you can actually look at what people are saying and tell for yourself whether it's true or not. We're not going by who has the biggest degree and is saying something, because you can always find somebody with a degree to say something. You can probably find someone with a PhD in something who says the Earth is flat. Now, I know you can certainly find people with PhDs in physics. There's a guy with a PhD in physics whose name escapes me for the moment, but he believes in chemtrails. He's a strong chemtrail believer, and yet he's demonstrably wrong. So just because someone is qualified doesn't mean that everything they say is going to be more correct than someone else. You really have to look at what people are actually saying.
On the kind of grand scheme of things, would you say that your epistemic beliefs in some of these things that you say on MetaBunk are actually due to basically virtually always from the mainstream?
Well, it kind of depends what you're talking about, because a lot of the stuff is fairly esoteric that doesn't even really, the mainstream media, for example, doesn't really talk about it. But if you want to talk about mainstream science, I know you do a lot of work in flat Earth debunking. And what you do, you could say is mainstream because it's mainstream science, and it's certainly the view of the world that the mainstream media would portray, and the alternative views are extremely alternative views. So, if you want to say, am I doing mainstream stuff? I believe in the standard model of the world, and I think that the standard explanation, the official explanation of the collapses of the buildings on 9/11 is fairly reasonable. So
you go with the 9/11 Commission report and the NIST report about the pancaking buildings?
Well, they didn't pancake as such. That's kind of a bit of a misnomer. It was a progressive collapse. The pancaking of floors isn't really a thing as such. But I think the NIST report, if you read the NIST reports in full, and I've gone through most of them, and it's quite a lot. It's thousands of pages. When you add up all the individual things, like the stuff, there's like one entire report just devoted to the fire, and then there's another one just about the mechanics of the building, and then there's the plane impacts. There's all kinds of things. But if you look at them as a whole, I think they're broadly correct. Now, I think there's certainly problems with them because there are simply limits to how much you can do with a small timescale investigation, and computing power at the time with the money that they had available didn't really allow them to do a full explanation. That's
actually one thing I wanted to get in to you with. I guess the U.S. spent about $5.6 trillion in different, obviously a lot of wartime type stuff since 2001. But also, I'm just wondering how you feel about the 9/11 Commission report being allocated about $15 million, and Tom Keene and Lee Hamilton saying that it was basically set up to fail, but also how we spent $40 million for the shuttle disaster. Starr spent $47 million and 5 years investigating Clinton. And as of recently, the Mueller report investigation was spent $25 million on taxpayer.
Well, I think what people miss there is that you essentially got the entire resources of the FBI and the CIA for free. And that's not factored into the cost of the investigation. After 9/11, the FBI and the CIA were putting pretty much half of their assets onto investigating 9/11. So it's not as if we've just got like a few $1 million thrown to a committee to do like one little report. We've got the entire force of the FBI, and the FBI has an extraordinarily large budget. I don't know what it is, but it's probably in the billions of dollars, and so half of that went to investigating 9/11, and not just for a few months, for years. So it's a misnomer it's a mistake to say that there's a small amount of money allocated to the investigation when really there was a huge amount of money allocated to the investigation.
The official numbers are 15 million, though.
But that's just for the report. That's just for people, writing the report, when they get to draw upon what the FBI did.
Well, we could say that about any of the ones that I just listed off. Mueller investigation, I'm sure a lot of the FBI manpower and time and stuff isn't actually into that. So the original claim was that 15 million was allocated for basically the biggest crime here in America. And the people that were in it they claim that it was pretty much set up to fail.
That's one quote from one guy. maybe two guys actually, I think.
Tom Keene and Lee Hamilton, those two. Yeah,
I guess you got to look into what they actually mean by that. The investigation was in part to identify failings in the U.S. defenses, and I think that they are correct to a degree, and that no one was really punished for the failings that led up to 9/11. So,
was anyone ever convicted of a crime through 9/11?
Not that I know of. Nothing that comes to mind. I mean, maybe it's some little incidental things like little local corruption revealed, but specifically there were problems on 9/11. Like jets were sent in the wrong direction. Like information wasn't passed between agencies. People were given visas when they perhaps shouldn't have been. So there's all these actual problems. But I think that there was a sense, perhaps from the upper levels of the government, that they didn't want to be pointing fingers and infighting when really the real enemy was across the ocean, and that they didn't want to distract from that. So it could well be that the commission was set up to fail in some regards, and that it didn't actually assign blame to the intelligence community for the failings of 9/11.
So you kind of touched on it, but how do you feel about the war games that were happening that day?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. People quite often bring things up like that. There were some drills in a lot of cases. Like they talk about the Boston Marathon, and there was some drill apparently happening at the same time. But I think a lot of those are kind of taken out of context. Like there was a drill for a plane hitting a building on the same day, which sounds like an amazing coincidence. When you look into what it was like they were talking about a small plane hitting a low building in a different part of the country, and it was just essentially like a fire drill type thing. What do we do in some?
Yeah, and George Bush and Condoleezza Rice denied that they've ever planned for anything like that, right? Planes hitting buildings.
Yeah, but when they say like that doesn't mean like a plane crashing into a building is this, essentially a simple matter of if it's a small plane hitting a small building, it's just something the fire department would deal with. But 4 planes being hijacked simultaneously and flown into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and possibly the Capitol might have been the other goal. I think it's reasonable to say that the descriptions of that day did not fit the parameters of things that they had thought of before. You can point at things like that in popular media. There were stories about. There was actually, I think, a TV show where they showed a plane crashing. I can't remember if it was the World Trade Center, but they did show something similar. So obviously, people think about these things, but does it mean that the government actually had an operational plan for what to do if planes were hijacked to go into the World Trade Center? I mean, clearly not. The goal back then, when a plane was hijacked, was to do what the hijacker says, and get them to land somewhere and then negotiate with them. And that's always been what happened before, and that's what allowed 9/11 to happen, just simply because there was no expectation, certainly amongst the pilots and the controllers, the air traffic controllers, about people actually flying planes into buildings. If they'd known that this was a thing, they would have told the pilots. They would have changed the policy. They would have put locks on the doors. They would have done the armored doors. All the stuff they did after 9/11 would have been. So there
was no protocol to say shoot down airplanes, mostly heading towards the White House or Pentagon or DC in general.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I think they probably had protocols for planes coming from outside of U.S. airspace, and maybe from inside. But I don't know what the protocol would have been. Obviously, things around White House security would be secrets. Like they wouldn't actually tell you exactly what the protocol was. But it could well be that they were planning to shoot down the plane that was heading towards the White House, at least. The Pentagon, the Pentagon, of course, was in a very difficult position to have shooting down planes because it was right under the flight path of an airport. There was planes going over there all the time. And also planes tend to wander into restricted airspace all the time. It's much more clamped down upon now, but back then it wasn't such a huge deal because people weren't thinking about this type of thing. You don't think about domestic threat. You think about threats coming from outside. So all of their focus was on, things coming from Russia or things being flown over the border with drugs. Or America's lucky in that we've got these oceans on either side of us, so it's actually pretty hard to get into it. And I think that kind of gave us a bit of a false sense of security back then.
So I listened to your last podcast, and what struck me out of pretty much everything that was said is you kind of, in a way, denied when the guy was talking about the buildings falling basically in the path of most resistance. Mm-hmm. And also you denied, and I'll let you obviously talk about it. I'm not trying to strawman you, but you kind of denied the firefighters' claims of molten metal.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think I gave quite a long explanation on both those things in the podcast. But basically, the path of least resistance is a bit of a misnomer. It's like if you think of dropping a rock into the ocean, there's no resistance to it going up, but there's some resistance to it going down. Why doesn't it go up? There's the reason it sinks into the ocean is that the force of gravity is greater than the buoyant force. So even though there's zero resistance to it going up or zero resistance to it going sideways, because there's a force pulling it down, gravity, very strong force, it sinks through the ocean, and essentially that's what happens with the tops of the buildings. You could kind of think of them as sinking. It's not really a good analogy because they're not fluids, but the top of the building fell through the bottom of the building because the bottom of the building, once the columns were no longer aligned and it was just a big falling mass stripping the floors away from the column, once you got that situation, the path of least resistance really is straight down when you add up the forces. There's no force going sideways. There's no force going upwards. There's a big force of gravity going down, and then there's a weaker force of the various components which are now misaligned, pushing back up. So, of course, it's going to fall down, and it's going to fall straight down.
I definitely, that's very unintuitive, and truthfully, we don't have many examples of this happening. I don't think science stops for a day, any day. But
we do have examples though. We have very large demolition, where all they do is they take out one floor in the middle of the building, and the top half of the building falls through the bottom half, and
and they also have to sever all of the core columns at precisely a specific timing. Correct?
No, they don't. They
really,
they take one floor and they rig this one floor with hydraulic jacks, and then they use these hydraulic jacks to push the columns out of alignment, so the top half of the building will fall down through the bottom half of the building. And they do remove a lot of the stuff from below the building, like obviously for like removing asbestos and things like that. But basically, they just use the weight of the building itself to collapse itself. Because buildings, especially tall buildings, are very, very specific in their vertical strength. And most of the strength of a building is in the columns. You look at the columns of the World Trade Center, they're these enormous thick things. I don't know if you've ever been to the 9/11 Memorial in New York, where they have some of the bases of the columns and they look just insanely strong. But then you've got to think that they have to support like 1,300 feet of more column on top of that. So that only works if you build it vertically. If you think of
I feel that there's a complete non sequitur in that you're talking about this taking out one floor. It has absolutely really nothing. We were trying to make connections of things that have happened that are similar to 9/11, and that is just a complete non sequitur in my opinion.
But the fires were only over a limited number of floors. You look at them, what actually would have been collapsing at the time, it wouldn't have been as neat as a very large demolition. But it would have been a floor or a few floors essentially that collapsed. The columns would have not been strong enough, and they would have gone out of alignment. And that would have been essentially the same thing. It's the same physics behind it. Although each building is different, you really have to look at the actual mechanics of the World Trade Center. I mean, you're familiar with the construction of the World Trade Center in the terms of the core and the floor panels and the outer wall. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah. And the mesh.
Yeah. So you know that the only thing that's connecting the outer walls to the core are the floor panels. There's no real, big, strong girder structure in between. There's no columns between the core and the outer walls. So if those floors, not the core itself, but the floors around the core, if those are stripped away between the core and the outer walls, then there's obviously the outer walls are going to collapse at that point because there's nothing holding them up. And the inner core itself becomes weakened because it doesn't have this lateral bracing from the outside. The collapse is very complicated. You're familiar with the thing called the spire?
I don't think so, actually.
The spire is, you've probably seen it, but what happened was after I think this is more visible on building 1, which was the last one to collapse, the one with the antenna on top. After building 1 collapsed, and to a certain extent same with building 2, half of the core was actually still standing when the rest of the building had hit the ground. So you can see this structure inside, and it's kind of like stripped away at the top, so it's kind of pointy shaped. So it looks a bit like a spire. You think of the spire on the Notre Dame Cathedral that fell a while back. But literally half the building was still standing. The core, literally half of the core was still standing for about, I think it was about 5 or 6 seconds after the exterior of the building had hit the ground. People think of just the top of the building falls all the way down and that's it, it's collapsed. But there's this very interesting thing with the spire, which kind of proves that what was happening was the floors around the core had been stripped away from that core, and then that core collapsed. You should check it out.
So I know you're very familiar, obviously, with Richard Gage and the paper that they produced, saying that there's these microspheres or this nano-thermite residue, basically. So are you denying that paper? Are you denying all that they've done?
Well, I'm not denying that paper exists. I'm just saying that some of their conclusions are wrong. With the iron microspheres, they say that the only explanation for these iron microspheres is that there was nano-thermite. And they go into it and say, it's molten iron. And so molten iron must have come from iron melting, and fire can't do that. Thermite can do that, therefore it must have been thermite. But what I was just simply pointing out is that there are all these other reasons why you can get iron microspheres. If you ever do any welding, you're making iron microspheres by the thousands every second. And there was an awful amount of welding going on during the construction of the World Trade Center, and a lot of that welding dust, which is entirely iron microspheres, would have remained in the building. And when it's tucked away from the elements, it doesn't actually rust. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff. During the cleanup, there was cutting going on. The fires themselves would have made iron microspheres, because when fire burns rusty steel, the rust flakes and the iron flakes get consumed in the same way that steel wool. Steel wool burns if you put a match to it. Doesn't require a very high temperature, and it sparks and makes all these iron microspheres. And there's a bunch of other ways as well. But basically, there are all these ways you can make iron microspheres, and yet architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth and the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Truth are saying this is the only way it could be. It can only be from nanothermite, and that's just flat wrong. So,
didn't they actually have actual chips that they ignited?
They had some chips, yeah. But the thing was, these chips, red and grey chips that they found, I found some chips that look exactly the same, and I burnt them, and they made iron microspheres. I found these chips on my wheelbarrow. I have a wheelbarrow that has a red coating, which I think is probably similar to the primer coating, red primer paint that they use on the World Trade Center. The trusses themselves were painted in red paint, and as they fell and they burnt and they collapsed, and all this paint flaked off basically, and so you have thousands of flakes of this paint. And if you look at it, it looks exactly the same as my chips. It's red on one side, which is the paint. It's grey on the other side, which is iron oxide, which is basically the surface of the steel that it's flaked off of. And it's flammable. And I've burnt it, and I made iron microspheres. So I basically replicated exactly the same thing. Now, they're going to quibble about the exact chemical makeup of the paint and things like that. But if you look at their own experiments that they do, they find all kinds of different red chips, some of which are consistent with some of the primer paint, some of which are not, but could have come from a different paint source. But basically, it looks exactly like paint chips. Really exactly like paint chips. And the composition of it isn't really nanothermite. they have iron oxide on one side, which is basically inert, unless you mix it with something, and in this case, it's not mixed with something. On the other side, what they had was essentially an organic binder with some flakes of stuff in it, and the organic binder is kind of like an epoxy type thing or a hydrocarbon, basically. So what happened was they stick it in this differential scanning colorimeter, whatever it was, and heated it up until it ignited, and then it burnt. And what's burning there is the epoxy, the paint.
Well, I'm going to say that that's probably the best explanation. And I guess a lot of this word conspiracy theorist, I might believe that we weren't told the official story, or the official story isn't actually correct. So a lot of times I feel like I'm painted in with flat earthers or people that doing transvestigations. And this is, in my opinion, something that some kind of a PR group or a think tank has done, to where all of these mainstream media articles, they'll talk about flat earth. Right below it, they'll talk about anti-vaxxers. They'll talk about flat Earth. They'll throw in ridiculous conspiracy theories to basically try to tar us, us with the same brush. And I feel that it actually gets into the kind of the public subconscious of going around and, hey, I have a different idea about this than what we're being told. Oh, what are you, a flat earther? So I feel that it's kind of a smear of a campaign.
Yeah, I could certainly see how you would think that, and it certainly is a problem. And I see this all the time. In my book, I talk about what I call the demarcation line. Like, everyone has some kind of line where they think things on one side of it are just silly conspiracy theories, and they think everything on the other side of it is actually sensible, conspiracy theories. And we all draw lines at different places, and everybody's kind of obsessed with not getting tarred by the same brush. They think that things just on the other side of their line are silly. Like, did you know David Chandler? Who's a kind of investigator. He's a former high school physics teacher or maths teacher.
I've heard of him.
Yeah. He, right now, is really obsessed with proving that a plane hit the Pentagon. And yet he's also a hardcore believer in the controlled demolition theory. So he is very upset that what he views as nonsense, this plane hitting the Pentagon, is being misidentified with his position, which he sees as a very sensible position, that simply that the towers were pre-rigged with explosives of secret nano-thermite and the planes were flown in by remote control. So he doesn't like being tarred by the same brush. And I once went to a conference for chemtrails, and there was a bunch of people there who were talking with aliens from another dimension. For some reason, there was a crossover conference, and the chemtrails people were really angry that these people had been allowed into the conference. So I think it's a natural reaction, but I don't think it's necessarily deliberate. I think obviously there is some people who will dismiss you because you're a conspiracy theorist, and they're thinking of all kinds of conspiracy theories. They're not looking at your specific one. But I think it's just something that comes with the territory. Just because there are ridiculous conspiracy theories, people tend to not look at the nuances.
Even on 9/11, it's like really the objective should be that, hey, in my opinion, at least, that what we're being told doesn't seem to match up. There's tons of cui bono, who benefits in this whole thing. And then we have people all of a sudden from Clues Forum and all these places saying that there's no planes, or Dr. Judy Wood saying that there's elite space weapons and all this stuff. And so, yeah, it seems like even in the flat Earth, like I've been obviously had a pulse on the flat Earth for a long time. And it seems like these things kind of come and go, and whatever sticks, the people that believe it will continue to perpetrate it. So things like, I don't know if you ever heard about it, but no forest on a flat Earth, that was picked up and then dropped really quickly because it was so dumb, I think. Mm-hmm. And so it's gone, right? But then there's other theories that come in, and whatever sticks, for some reason, it seems like all you need to do is give a person an idea, the right person an idea, and if they have a following, or they're able to get it to another person that has a following, the perpetration is just rampant. Like you can't stop it.
Have you heard of the mud flood theory?
Oh yeah, I was just talking about that before I called you. Yeah,
Yeah, because that's kind of similar to the no forest on flat Earth in terms of its kind of ridiculousness. I don't know. What do you think about the theory, and what do you think? You think it's this type of deliberate disinformation, or?
Yeah, I think it's for sure deliberate. One of those, in my opinion, probably a PR company or some think tank that has some ideas, and they'll give just a little bit of information. And there's people that there's this UK guy I was talking about that is obsessed with it, and he's got like 900 people watching his live YouTube channel where he's just looking at pictures, and some of them are known to be fake, like that giant you've probably seen, the Asian giant or whatever, that was just it was an intro into some movie or something that they're picking up on. And so yeah, I mean, really, I've actually removed myself from, for the most part, this crowd, because the people aren't objective. Like, there's no cui bono who benefits for the Earth being flat. The mud tard thing, in my opinion, doesn't go anywhere. There's no objective to it. As far as these $1 trillion wars that we're doing over, on the other side of the world, I think these are much more important, because actual American soldiers actually go there to die, and if it's for a false premise, it's really messed up. And there's been things like Operation Northwoods that I'm sure you're familiar with, where it's basically outlining false flags that they could do to get into war with Cuba. And this isn't the first thing. I mean, Gulf of Tonkin incident and others we were not told the correct information, and a lot of times it seems as though they're trying to get the public perception to go hoorah rah America to go to war for false pretenses.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think I write about both of those, Northwoods and Tonkin, in my book. And I looked into Tonkin quite a lot. It was very interesting. It doesn't seem like it was a planned thing. It was Robert McNamara was Secretary of Defense back then, and he was actually looking for an excuse to attack North Vietnam, because he wanted to destroy their industrial capacity. And there was this incident with the ship, thinking it was being attacked by torpedo boats. And they called in and said, we're under attack. And McNamara says to Johnson that we need to attack. And then they later say, oh, wait, we don't think it was. We think it's just like a faulty radar return. And they had the records of them actually doing this. But McNamara just didn't tell Johnson about this. He kind of withheld that information and didn't move forward. So it's kind of like factions within the government were fighting against each other. Johnson didn't really want to get into it as much as McNamara did. McNamara knew this, and so he had to kind of, in a way, lie to Johnson to get him to actually attack North Vietnam. And once they did the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and they did a bombing run, then basically they were all in and it was irrelevant. But the truth came out on that one eventually. There was quite detailed records of the interceptions of communications and the mistranslations and the faulty returns, and there wasn't actually anything going on that second attack, second day at the Gulf of Tonkin. But it was misrepresented greatly to the American public and to Johnson, the president at the time.
And this is why you have to understand at a certain point that as far as the conspiracy-minded people, we have been disenfranchised, because a lot of times we do research into these things, like, the pretext, or one of the pretexts for the Gulf War was that 15-year-old Naira testifying about babies in incubators when she was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. And it was set up by a PR company, Hill and Knowlton, employed by Citizens for a Free Kuwait. Yeah. So a lot of these things are to get into the minds of Americans, like I said. And so 9/11 is like the ultimate the ultimate way to go to war with the Middle East. And I forget the general's name, but he said. Powell? No, the general that said that basically they had a plan for like 7 different countries or something.
Petraeus, I think, wasn't it?
Wesley Clark.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a lot of these examples of, hey, we have a mission, and what we have to do is basically get the American people, kind of like PNAC. We need a catalyzing event such as Pearl Harbor.
New Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And,
no,
and
I know what you're saying.
happens.
I know what you're saying, and to a large extent, I agree with what happened in that 9/11 was definitely used as an excuse to invade. Yeah, they invaded Iraq, which had really nothing to do with 9/11, but the American public were fine with that because they just they see the whole of the Middle East as being this one broad thing. But yeah, I don't think that necessarily means that the American government did 9/11.
Well,
it means that they definitely they benefited from it. Some of them did.
Yeah, they benefited from it, and at a certain point, Osama bin Laden obviously helped with the Mujahideen and I think his CIA or FBI with the USSR long ago. And obviously that whole, I think, what was it, not Bindar Bush, but he had a large extended family, and the family seemed to be friends with Bush. And I think even one of his brothers died in a weird plane accident in Texas or something. I forget. It's been a long time, but it's kind of naive almost in my opinion, for you to be able to see all these things that they've done in the past and kind of be like, well, nothing to see here on 9/11, and these theories about the buildings falling in the way that they did, and it's hard for me to believe, man.
I hear what you're saying, but I did look into these a lot, into Northwoods and the Gulf of Tonkin. Northwoods was a proposal document that was floated around by the chiefs of staff about trying to get pretext to invade Cuba. But I don't really see the parallels in scale between what was proposed back then and 9/11. The idea that you would need something like destroying the World Trade Center in order to justify invading Iraq. They could have just let a bomb off in the U.S. embassy and not killed anybody, or like had some chemical weapons discovered somewhere, or fake some satellite photographs. It doesn't take that much.
How about the 1993, I believe it was, bombings of the World Trade Center? Have you ever researched into that? Where the guy actually comes out and said that he was FBI informant. He recorded their phone calls.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it in great detail, but I've heard of that. But I don't think it was specifically very strong evidence. Because why are we believing this guy? He could be just saying this for some other reason.
He recorded the phone calls, is what I'm saying.
Do you have the recordings of the phone calls?
Not me personally right now. No, this has been quite a while.
Yeah. No, I don't. I think that again is probably what it appears to be, like jihadist terrorists fighting what they view as the Great Satan. Like, they don't like America because of its involvement in the Middle East. We know that
to a certain extent. Don't you agree with them, though? I mean, if you were on the other side of the world,
I agree. Yeah. I do agree. I'm not so sure. I'm not on the side of ISIS. However, I think that America's imperialism has historically been overreaching, and America has been involved in nation building and in overthrowing governments. This is something that's well known, that the CIA has been involved in overthrowing governments, and they're involved in foreign propaganda to a large extent, trying to influence things like foreign elections. Look at what's going on in Venezuela right now. There's obviously people maneuvering in the United States government because they want a specific outcome. So they're meddling in other countries' elections, essentially. Not that I'm supporting one side or the other in Venezuela, but just looking at it, it's historically the type of thing the U.S. has done, especially in South America. There's the policy, was it the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically saying South America is ours. You guys all keep out. We're the ones who are going to control everything that goes on in South America. I'm not a fan of America's foreign policy. I think it's too imperialist and it's too interventionist. And we need to work more as a global community rather than America being the world's police and trying to exploit the world.
Yeah. Well, we have things like Operation Mockingbird, I'm sure you've heard, from the 50s to 70s, and I would argue probably still going on. CIA paid domestic and foreign journalists to publish CIA propaganda. We have things like Operation Ajax, Operation Snow White, Operation Gladio, Operation Paperclip. So there's been documented, even by them, obviously, clandestine operations that continue to happen, and a lot of them have been to get us to war. So is there a possibility that you are afraid of the implications that 9/11 could have had elements of the government involved?
No, not at all. I don't see. What I focus on are the collapses of the buildings and whether there was controlled demolition involved. I think there is an outside possibility that the hijackers could have been influenced by somebody from America. I don't know who that is, or if it's someone in power, but it could be that this is something that's. I wouldn't completely discount the possibility. I think it's also possible that the U.S. government downplayed the threats that they had been receiving because some people wanted there to be an attack. They didn't realize how big it was going to be, but they wanted there to be an attack so they could use this as an excuse. So there are certainly possibilities that I wouldn't discount, and I try never to really discount every single possibility. But when it comes to things like the demolition of the Twin Towers, not only is that completely implausible, it doesn't seem necessary, and there's no evidence to support it happening. So, that really I have to kind of just based on purely on the evidence itself, what we see.
Yeah, I find it implausible that, and this is where a lot of conspiracy people get it wrong, is that they try to say that there's never been a building that has collapsed due to office fires alone, and it's like, no, actually, dude, there's a plane that just hit it, obviously.
Yeah.
So there's a huge other factor in that, but I find it implausible that these buildings fall, and count my words here, virtually at free fall speed, mostly Building 7, when it was just hit, or it had, diesel fires or whatever the excuse is nowadays. I find it highly implausible that 38 steel columns virtually collapsed at the same time for that to happen and fall in its footprint.
Yeah, and I understand that. Lots of people do find it implausible, but most people don't have very much experience with the collapses of large buildings. How many internal structures of buildings have you actually studied that have been through similar damage to even World Trade Center 7?
Well, this is where I defer to people actually that are putting their credentials on the line, such as Richard Gage and the 1,000+ others, architects and engineers, that even me and you, we're comparatively probably laymen compared to these people that actually do this in the field. So
But then you see them making all these ridiculous mistakes and not correcting their mistakes. Like Richard Gage, head of the architects and engineers from 9/11 Truth, he's been rabbiting on about this one column that he says was cut at an angle, and that somehow is evidence of controlled demolition. And he's got this photograph of this column that was cut at an angle, and there's some firemen stood in front of it, and he says, "Oh, this proves that it was in the few days after the collapse because there's firemen in the photo." And yet the firemen were on the scene for nearly a year afterwards because they were constantly recovering human remains from the site. So firemen were there all the time. And not only that, I actually found photos of that column from 6 weeks after where it was still standing. It hadn't been cut. And I found a photo from the same day where it had been cut. So I found the actual day on which it was cut. And yet Richard Gage has been using this as evidence, and quite compelling evidence for a lot of people, because he's got his weight of authority behind it, being an architect, for over a decade. Yeah, and he never figured out that it was wrong.
When I first started listening to them and watching with their content, it was mostly like, hey, we're not going to go into the no planes and the complete crazy conspiracies of it. These people that are obviously qualified kind of had questions about the collapse. And that's why I did support them at the beginning. And really, this has been, 18 years now. And it's hard to continue this for a long time, because the public perception for the most part still is that, terrorists came. And I'd like to ask you this question. Do you believe that there was a passport found unscathed of one of the terrorists?
Yeah, I do.
How do you think that happens?
Well, passports are very light, and they would have been in the front of the plane, possibly like in a jacket pocket or something like that. And basically, when the plane entered the building, it disintegrated because it got hit by a bunch of columns, and then there was a huge explosion, and stuff got thrown out the other side of the building. And if something is in a essentially low-speed explosion, like a fuel-air explosion, you can just get pushed out by the wind. The thing was, there was lots of paper on the ground. You saw, one of the more defining moments, from the building,
from the office building,
and there were also other things recovered from within the plane. And if you look at any plane crash, they pretty much all crash in a ball of flame. And yet, when you look at the end results of them, you see things that are not burnt. You see things that are, you see passports. If you look at the plane that crashed in the Ukraine, was shot down by a missile, by a Buck missile, they gathered all the passports. And there was intact human remains in that case, but not so much in the 9/11 case, obviously. But I don't think it's at all implausible that small objects with a small mass can survive. We're not talking about large things surviving. We're talking about small light things like a passport, which weighs like 20 grams or something. And if it's inside a jacket pocket, you can pretty much you could set up a stick of dynamite next to it, and it would survive.
Yeah, that to me is completely implausible, if not impossible.
Give it a go.
It's very telling that you would say that in that event that we could see through different video cameras, that magically a passport.
It's not just a passport though. There's all kinds of things with the seat cushions from the plane were recovered. Now, if a seat cushion can get it through, why couldn't a passport get through?
Yeah, it's just, I kind of, to switch gears really quickly, we're about 15 minutes left if you still wanted to do an hour, but Are you okay with the big pharma and Israel lobby in America?
Big pharma, as in pharmaceuticals?
Companies? Yeah.
I'm not okay with any lobbying company in America because I think they all have their own self-interests at heart and they don't have the public interest. I just think, like we talked about earlier, the entire U.S. system of government is corrupt because of all this influence from lobbying. So, I'm not okay with big pharma's lobbying and the revolving door of regulatory agencies. I don't know what you mean by the Israel lobby, but, I'm...
AIPAC?
Yeah, but it's not really something I'm very familiar with.
Okay.
So
what about how do you feel about the vaccine whistleblower about the possible correlation of MMR and autism?
I don't think it's true. If you look at what was actually presented as being whistleblowing, it was just like some report that if you look into it in depth, and I can't remember the details right now, it doesn't actually show a conclusive correlation.
Well, let's get our words right. I did say possible correlation, and then you said conclusive. Right. It's kind of like saying scientific proof. That's what flat earthers like to say. So,
yeah, but I'm talking there's lots of other studies besides that don't show a correlation. In fact, show quite conclusively by doing like large population studies that there is no link between the vaccine and autism.
So when all these parents come out and say that they had a happy little vibrant little kid, and they go and take their shots that are supposedly safe for them, and they come home and they see seizures, they see them become autistic over the years. And also obviously in 1986 they passed the whole you can't sue basically the vaccine companies. I mean, don't you see that there's any kind of correlation between this kind of this huge conglomerate of obviously monetary regard that they could be giving fake science or hiding science or paying other people to do what they...
If you look at things like tobacco,
Yep.
Obviously there was cover-ups back then where people covered up evidence of wrongdoing, of the harmful effects of tobacco and nicotine. So if you just look at that, it seems like sure there could be Big Pharma covering things up, and there probably are instances where Big Pharma is covering up or at least trying to hide bad results on certain things. But when you look at things like the MMR vaccine, there's a huge amount of independent research that has been done, not just by the manufacturers. We're not just talking about the manufacturers' studies. We're talking about government studies.
Who's paying them, though? Who's paying them? Are they just doing it on their own goodwill?
The government pays them. It's a lot of government grants for this type of thing. And other countries do it.
And never any pharmaceutical companies paying these independent researchers.
Oh, I'm sure there's instances where the
I got to keep you honest, man, because sometimes your wording seems like you're trying to play things off, and then we have to kind of go through.
I'm not trying to play it off. I agree with you that there's a profit motive, but with vaccines, it doesn't really make any sense. That,
Really?
how much money are they actually making from vaccines? They're essentially
enough to have basically
products.
the biggest lobby, enough to have the biggest lobby basically in America, and pay these politicians that are supposed to be working for us Americans, that end up being career politicians that come out being, hundreds of millions of dollars or, tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah, but then there's all this independent research that at some point would reveal that this is going on. If really vaccines are really this big of a problem, then it would be apparent in the data. It's not something you can just sweep under the
It's
rug.
kind of like climate change. I mean, there's quite a bit of money tied up with these whole companies, and really, I'm kind of the stance of epistemologically, I can't, I don't know that there's climate change, or I don't, I know that there's not climate change or anything like that, but I try to see like the motives behind these things, and I try to listen to debates. I go to MetaBunk, I go to Snopes, I listen to conspiracy theorists. I try to disseminate the information for myself, and at the end of the day, a lot of times there are agendas that happen, and a lot of these people are actually being funded by big oil or big pharma or even the drug and it seems as though
I certainly
there's a conflict of interest.
We shouldn't just trust everything on its face. We should look at the broader picture. But we've only got like 10 minutes or so left. Could we talk a bit about your work with flat Earth debunking?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Why did you start doing that?
From the very beginning, basically for 2 weeks, I wouldn't say I was a flat earther, but I was very conspiratorial minded. I was down the rabbit hole, as you probably would put it. And so I was deeply researching into it. And one of the first things I did was I would go to Goodwill and look at, older books. And I think one of them was like a 1913 astronomy book, like Practical Astronomy. And I looked into how there's obviously two celestial points, and this is something that flat earthers cannot reconcile with even still to this day, and things like the sun not changing in angular size throughout the day, and rising and setting, and the moon doing the same. These things couldn't be reconciled with for me. So being that I was breaking my conspiratorial bias due to flat Earth, truthfully, I was naive enough to think that I could come out and try to help people to truly be, quote unquote, awake to this whole situation of this is a lie. This is something, me and you really can't prove the intentions and the motives behind the people that may or may not have been involved with 9/11. But me and you can go out and test the shape of the Earth. So I went to Great Salt Lake, which is an absolute killer for flat Earth. I mean, you have mountains at different distances all around you. Sometimes you're standing right next to the water and you can see a mountain that's 85 miles away. You can see the whitecap sitting on the water. And so basically my whole thing was, and I'm done with flat Earth, truthfully, but 4.5 years of trying to keep these people honest, the Jaronisms, the Dearths, all these people, trying to keep them honest, because in my opinion, and I've said it for years, this is a PSYOP, a psychological operation. to basically make us look, tar us all with the same brush, make us look stupid. And then a couple years later, we see anytime you put in flat Earth in the news, you see anti-vaxxers, you see every 9/11 conspiracy. So exactly what I was saying to reach the public psyche is happening, in that conspiracies are dumb and they're all debunked because they're just a bunch of wackos and whack jobs thinking of, mud floods and all this shit. And so I thought I was very naive that I could come out and say, hey, look, there's evidence that you can go and see. Look at the stars. So for the first 2 years, I was saying things like that. And then I decided to go ahead and use some of my equipment, my drones, and I got two P900s, actually, D3200. I got a bunch of equipment. And I went out to Lake Tahoe. I went to Great Salt Lake. I went all over doing star photography, doing just photography of things being obstructed. Like Salt Lake City is like 350 feet is obstructed over 26 miles. I mean, it's just, you can go out there, and because the water temperature is so close to the air temperature, a lot of times there's not too many temperature inversions happening. So you can go out there on a decent day and see the effects of the Earth's curvature. So it never was enough. It was purely rhetoric for the first couple years, and then I came out with evidence. The drone is absolutely killer. Seeing Strong's Knob from 37 miles away, you can't see it until you're about 15 feet up, and you start rising, and you start to see more and more of not only Strong's Knob, but all of the other mountains. So this is indicative to me of a curved surface. So unfortunately, the flat Earth argument has evolved into its final stages of the infinite regression, where they're talking about atmosphere without a container and the second law of thermodynamics and entropy, when they have zero idea what these physics concepts actually mean. But they'll continue to evolve their arguments, and their arguments are at the final regression, in my opinion, to where they'll die on a hill to say these things continuously and literally think in their own mind that the Earth is flat, and these are good arguments for it.
Yeah, it's quite a challenge. I remember starting out debunking chemtrails back in 2007, and I naively thought that I could just find the correct explanations for contrails and give them to people, and then that would be it. But of course, here we are, 16 years later, 17 years later, 18 years later. Good grief.
I kind of liken it to somewhat of a cult or some kind of a religious movement where it's kind of anomalous when we're trying to, God doesn't exist or God does exist. Well, this is something where we can, like I said, go out and actually test it and find these things for ourselves. And it's still to where I've only seen probably about 10 people, because of my work and some other people's work, that have come out of the flat Earth and come back to the globe. And there's this huge community aspect to it where these people are so disenfranchised, most likely due to all their conspiracy knowledge over the years. And so they find a like-minded group. And they also have something where the Tiger Dans, the Matrix Decodes, the people that come out of flat Earth end up getting absolutely stomped on by flat earthers. I mean, I saw things from Tiger Dan saying, if you were on fire, I wouldn't piss on you. I mean, it was so terrible how they treat people that come out of flat Earth. So when you have this kind of belief and this whole community aspect to it, it's really, really hard to get them out of it, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's interesting because sometimes people talk about how mainstream scientists don't look at 9/11 because they're afraid of what it will do. But there's also the opposite effect that you just described, where people in a conspiracy culture, you've got this whole social dynamic where if they come out, they're going to be ostracized and they're going to lose essentially their family. A lot of it, people have a good time doing these things. I'm going to go to the Flat Earth Expo. Escaping the Matrix Expo in Las Vegas in a couple of weeks. And, I kind of expect the people to be having a good time, talking about their shared beliefs and their shared interests. And you see people having flat Earth parties. And they're all there, it's a good, happy family. And you probably have the same thing in every field, like UFOs, 9/11, I don't know if you have anti-vaccine parties, but quite possibly people get together in a social setting. So there's an interesting dynamic that's difficult to get past.
Yeah, and I was actually going to talk to you about that because Infinite Plane Society just emailed me with Mick West versus Nathan Thompson. I don't know if you've heard of Nathan Thompson, but I feel as if IPS is actually setting him up to fail, considering he's, in my opinion, one of the worst flat earthers. I've actually kicked him out of the flat earth. Go. But
he's got a good memory, so he can reel off a whole bunch of things. I've looked at a few of his videos, and I've been hanging out on his Facebook group. So he doesn't give very good arguments, and they're usually easily refuted, and then he just ignores the explanation. I'm not sure what the organizers are thinking specifically. I don't think they were setting him up to fail. Perhaps just he's the only person they could get, because they're kind of a little bit on the fringe with Mad Mike and the Infinite Plane Society. Don't seem to be really mainstream flat Earth, if there is such a thing.
Yeah, and if you actually listen to Infinite Plane Society, he does shows, probably like 1 o'clock your time in the night. He talks about mostly these death fakers, and truthfully, the guy is very intelligent, but I think there's some ulterior motive with what he does. I'm not really sure that he actually holds these beliefs, but he does continue to talk about them for hours and hours about, Nipsey Hussle, which is, I'm not into the numerology, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of that nonsense, but there is some striking correlations to be made with just that one. But, the Isaac Cappy or whatever, that guy just killed himself, I guess, the other day. And, that was the discussion last night, where it's a death faker, possible death faker. And so he almost is almost like a high functioning intellect, but also somewhat, to me, at the bottom of the barrel of conspiracies. And I've personally, when he came out to city council or something and started talking about bubbles in space and green screens and all this stuff, I literally went through all of his claims and showed him why he's wrong. The Nomex blue demonstration screen that Dearth first said that it was a green screen, which had white checkerboards on. It was in the payload of the ESA. I showed all this stuff to him, and it's just, if it seems to fall on deaf ears, and I don't know why. I don't understand why.
He has this. He calls himself an auto hoaxer, where he claims like he's taking the default position that everything is fake, and you have to prove to him otherwise. Which I think is kind of an extreme position, because everything being fake. I'm close to it because it's the default position, I suppose you could say, of somebody disenfranchised by known liars. Like the mainstream media, I don't watch it because all I see is agenda. It actually doesn't make me feel good at all to watch these people do what they do. Then you got your pharmaceutical commercials right afterwards. And it's astounding what America has become. And I feel, to a certain extent, it would be nice, and I haven't read your book yet, but it would be nice if you actually, and I think you did actually, go into things that are known conspiracies, because a lot of times those known conspiracies, say Mockingbird or some of these things, have a nugget of truth in them when you hear it from a conspiracy-minded person, but then you can also deconstruct some of the obvious fakery that they're saying about that. So, yeah, this is where I personally hope to make a difference, is in just basically figuring out things that are false and promoting them. Like I don't look at things like vaccines, because there's so many other people talking about it, and people that know a lot more about it than I do. But there really wasn't very many people investigating into the chemtrail stuff. Even now, like with Flat Earth, there's so many people debunking Flat Earth now. And it's become a circus in a way. It's basically like one side saying the other side is an idiot, and then the other side making up this more and more outlandish explanations for things, and then the other side debunking that. And really, I think I might be out of Flat Earth after this conference if nothing really changes. It's going to be an interesting meeting all these people who actually presumably some of them genuinely hold these beliefs. So I really would like to try to figure out what makes them tick, and hopefully I'll meet some of them.
Yep. It's I hope you will be, actually, because actually what happens is, and I totally agree with you, there's these fight the flat earths, these team skeptics, these people that literally have, on the backs of flat earth, in my opinion, PSYOP, have made a business out of quote unquote debunking it. And a lot of time they're wrong. And a lot of time they'll say that these people are mentally ill, but also then berate them continuously, saying they're effing idiots or they're pieces of whatever. And so it's like, you don't go to your local crazy house and start calling these people idiots and all this kind of stuff. There's a certain amount of tact that's necessary. And for me, at the beginning, I wasn't tactful. I was very vitriolic. I did some bad things probably within the first year, but I started to it started to grow on me a little bit, and I've actually it's changed my life, and it seems really stupid, but I can tell you from a very hardcore conspiracy theorist before Flat Earth hit, it's changed my life so much that I'm not on the complete mainstream side. I'm not on the complete conspiracy side. I'm somewhere in the middle, and everybody wants to see things in black and white, but I'm in the middle where I try not to say things that I don't personally know, and that gets into epistemology and a lot of philosophy as well. But a lot of stuff I was saying before, I just heard from Alex Jones, or I heard from here and there, and I wasn't going to the MetaBunks, I wasn't going to the Snopes to fact check. And there's a lot of times where I go to Snopes and I'm like, this didn't even actually answer the question, and this is just a complete whitewash of what happened. So I'm still able to disseminate the information, basically. Yeah. But we are past our hour mark, man. I appreciate you having a chat. And, it seems that we're kind of at odds as far as some of our beliefs. But at the end of the day, this is how you can come and talk to somebody and not be vitriolic and share ideas. And hey, I'll always say things like the passport. I think you're a nutter about that.
Well,
but we'll laugh about it. It's cool.
Yeah, no, but I think with passports, it almost makes me want to do an experiment with a small fuel air bomb. And I've actually kept some of my old passports for that reason. I have an old passport, and I took a page out of it, and I soaked it in kerosene and set it on fire just to see what would happen with it. And it's something I've been thinking about, just because it is, it's very counterintuitive, and it's one of these arguments that's compelling because it's hard to counter it just with words. You really have to do a demonstration of what's going on. So maybe one day I will try blowing up a passport. And you're out in the desert, or you have access to the desert, so maybe you could pop out there with a cherry bomb and a jug full of gasoline and a couple of passports. All right. Well, thank you very much. This has been a fascinating discussion, and like you say, I think it's good that we can talk like this, even though we do have some areas of disagreement. We also have some areas of agreement, and we can look at where the boundary of those areas are and work around that.
Awesome. So, thanks again, man.
Thank you very much.